Welcome to Feminist Frequency Radio. This is the show that asks you to be critical of the media you love. I'm Anita Sarkeesian.
And I'm Kat Spada, and this season, our feminist media criticism is brought to you by the Tyrell Corporation, because this is the season of cyberpunk. Tyrell, meeting all your synthetic humanoid needs.
Mr. Deckard, Dr. Eldon Tyrell.
The new millennium, this is amazing, will bring a new experience.
How do you fit all that in your head anyway?
I had to dump a chunk of long-term memory.
This is gonna be fun, Terry.
Who is this?
Take this thing out of the case and stick it up your nose.
Mozart's Ghost, the hottest band on the internet.
This week we are discussing Blade Runner, Ridley Scott's 1982 film adaptation of Philip K. Dick's 1968 novel, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? Set in the dystopian Los Angeles of 2019, Harrison Ford plays a cop hunting down bioengineered androids known as replicants who have returned to Earth from the space colonies where they were sent to work as slave labor.
I was looking for 6 replicants in a city of 106 million people.
You ever see this girl, huh?
Never seen a Buzzlove.
What I didn't know was they were looking for me.
Joining us to discuss this film is the Washington Post's award-winning television critic, previously a writer for The Hollywood Reporter, Slate, MTV News, and The Village Voice. She is the co-host of the All About Almodovar and All About Campion podcasts, and her essay, Notes from the Underground, accompanies Parasite's inclusion in the Criterion Collection. Welcome to the show, Inkoo Kang.
Hi, that was a really thorough bio.
Read some interviews, and then actually I was really enjoying listening to it's like one podcast that sort of alternates between Almodovar and Campion episodes, or is it 2 distinct shows?
We had 2 seasons.
And they were like first Campion, then Almodovar, or I kind of listened to them out of order, I think.
Oh, interesting. First Almodovar and then Campion. Almodovar because my co-host Daniel Schrader is a gay man who had never watched an Almodovar movie, and it really upset me. And we were both trapped in our homes during COVID, so we just watched movies together, like talking on the phone the whole time. Very like flashback to 1982, actually.
That's right. Before the second screen experience.
Oh yes. I guess it's a second audio experience. I don't know. But that's how that came about. And it was actually really interesting, sort of like thinking through these directors' works from someone who had not really watched them before. And, you know, I think not to like already start bootlicking Tyrell style, but I think this idea of like thinking critically through things that you love is really important. And so that was like a really great way to do that with those 2 particular podcasts, which are about filmmakers I love, but also there's a lot to critique there.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. That's great. I'm always looking for a new podcast to listen to. Like I bounce off of them so hard, and I'm so excited about all the dope people that Kat's brought on to this season. Cause now I'm like, I got to go listen to all of your podcasts. Like those sound fucking amazing. So yeah, thanks so much for joining us.
Really.
So what is your relationship to Blade Runner? Have you seen it before? Do you have feelings about it before this particular episode of rewatching it?
I have an incredibly nerdier than the usual level of nerd relationship to Blade Runner.
Bring it.
Dope.
I watched it for the first time as part of a graduate seminar. I forget what the class was. I think it was sort of like the political theories on necropolises or something along those lines.
Cool.
But basically, yeah, we read it in conjunction with a professor of Asian American studies, sort of like analysis of this movie as a multicultural dystopia. And I am a person who grew up in Los Angeles, and therefore the sort of like way that this movie depicts sort of this like vision of like futuristic white flight combined with like, what if the Asians took over and then like everything would be so ugly and gross? Like that really hit hard for me. And so it's always been really impossible for me to extricate that sort of like first experience, even while being able to really admire the, of course, like the production design and like its play with neo-noir and all of these like really beautiful references to 1940s films visually. But it's always to me sort of this like very specific document of anxieties from the 1980s. This idea of like, the hardened inner city and the rise of Asia. And so, yeah, I also feel like it's not a masterpiece, and we can get into this when I stop talking, but it's a really uneven film, and I understand why people are really into it, but at the same time, I hope that people can be a little bit more honest about like some just like technical stuff it has like not going for it. Pacing, characters that like character dynamics that make no sense. So yeah.
Yeah. Kat, what's your relationship with Blade Runner?
I feel like I'm usually pretty open to stuff, even things where I'm like, oh no, cultural osmosis maybe has set this up for me and I haven't seen it. But like Blade Runner is a movie I have tried to watch many times and I had never finished it before.
Wow.
I have always found it interminably boring. And and like my mom used to work in the Bradbury building. So I remember when I was like a teenager, like trying to watch this movie because I was like, yeah, like I've gone to my mom's office and like ridden in the cool elevator with the elevator operator and da da da. And so I've always tried to watch it as like this aesthetic movie, and it is really aesthetically pleasing, like sensual in a way that I want to watch it, but I really have never have been sucked in. So I watched it this time, and like I made a little note in our show outline that even trying to write what the plot of this movie is, I was like, well, if I were writing it the way I just read it, it's like about a bad guy who is not the hero, but I don't know if that's objectively true. Like, what is the story of this movie? So I found it really, really othering in a way that, like, that's probably all of our experience of watching a lot of like typical Hollywood movies. But much of the time, I feel like I can put that aside and watch the movie and even enjoy a movie. But this just felt like so relentlessly not for you if you are a woman, not for you if you are an Asian person, not for you. Like really watching it, I was like, man, I guess I could have this on mute during a party and find the visuals compelling. But yeah, this is the first time. And actually, I did have to pause about halfway through and take a break and still finish watching it. And like, you know, I don't know. My Freq Out is going to be a 3-hour documentary. So like, clearly I have the stamina for long movies. And this, I don't know, is this even a long movie? I just couldn't. But Anita, you're like, I'm kind of surprised that we're on the sides we're on with this movie. Maybe.
Yeah, a little bit, right? Yeah. So, okay, before I talk about my relationship to it, I specifically, there's 7 versions of this movie.
Right.
And I specifically did not like say which one we should watch because I was really curious what we were all going to land on, and depending on whether you've seen it or not before. So like, what version do you even know what versions you all watched?
I know I watched the final cut, which is
the standard one that people end up watching. Yeah,
I did too, because it was the one on HBO Max.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So I like Blade Runner, like despite all of the things, we'll link in the show notes that we made an episode of The Freak Show, which was a show that Feminist Frequency used to make about Blade Runner and how racist and fucked up this movie actually is, right before the sequel came out. So, be critical of the media you love. I decided to watch the theatrical release, which was not received well. And I learned why. But because I had already seen the director's cut and the one that, like, you know, generally are the ones that people now consider like the definitive version of this movie. Because I just kind of wanted to see what the differences were and what it went. So we can, what that meant. And so we can get into that. But I like got a little high and watched this movie again and just got so sucked into it in a way that I remember watching it before and like really appreciating the aesthetic and like the lighting and the practical effects and like thinking it looked really cool and like moody and all of that. But I remember, I think I was like a little bit bored, and I think Getting High was this really sweet spot where I'm like, oh, I can just like lean back and kind of take it in a way that really worked for me. Except one of the differences, the theatrical version has these horrific voiceovers that Harrison Ford does, and it was imposed on the film because there was some testing that didn't go well. And so like just exposition dump. And he delivered those lines so badly. And he denies this, but people think that he butchered them on purpose to make sure that they didn't get used. And so I swear to God, you're like zoning out and you're into it. And like, you know, you're looking at the lights and the lighting and the shadows and all that shit. And then all of a sudden it's like, and then I walked into the place and I felt a feeling, and you're just like, what the fuck? Like it was so dramatic and so bad, like so bad. But yeah, anyways. Okay. So that's my I like the aesthetic. I think that it's really interesting. I don't disagree with anything, Inkoo, that you said when you started. I think that this film is extremely problematic, and like I find a lot of joy in like being able to unpack that and talk about it. But I do like it just hits a spot for me.
It really reminded me a lot of The Hunger, which is, you know, like a very similar time period, you know, also sort of takes place in this kind of urban dystopian moment where death is like very cheap and also everything's super stylized. And yeah, if I was high and I watched The Hunger, you know, for like a second time and I wasn't thinking too critically about it, it would be an amazing experience. But you guys made me think about this movie. And so, you know.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a big question here of, you know, and Kat, you were like, I don't know how to describe the movie. Like, yeah, Deckard is an anti-hero. He's kind of a piece of shit guy, you know, and the film, I think, talking about replicants and who is human and what is humanity and what does that mean, and is it okay that these replicants are slaves and sex workers and exploited in various ways. And like one of the big problems of this movie is like it's set in this environment that is supposed to be this like hodgepodge of culture. It's all of these white people, and the question of who is human and what is humanity is really rooted in like white male, like cis men, right? Like, and that I think is the core structure, the core narrative, like theme of this movie is already flawed in that fact.
I think so much of the movie wants to be about these sort of like high flying philosophical, like really vague ideas of like who is human. But I like, to me, it really seems obvious that the like most important question in Blade Runner is not who is human. It is like, how should we treat others? Like with a capital O.
Right.
And for me, it feels so obvious that one of the metaphorical uses of the replicants is that they're immigrants. They're like a source of like labor that we think that humans should not have to do, or that we think is not safe enough for humans to do. And they also have to be contained in their influence and in their propagation so that like larger mainstream society can go on and sort of like be the thing that it wants to be. And so to, on the one hand, be a story about immigrants, and then also to kind of like villainize and exotify like what in this universe would be immigrants is just very short-sighted and obviously like very indicative of like who Ridley Scott thinks he's making this movie for. And yet at the same time, it's such a very common Hollywood trope to sort of say, what if this awful thing that routinely happens to people of color or used to happen to them actually happened to a white person? That would be horrible. And that's sort of like the tradition in which Blade Runner is for me.
Yeah, absolutely. So just another point about the voiceovers, which you luckily didn't have to deal with, is there is a little bit of race like exposition that happens in the voiceovers that is also really cringy. But so for, we see James Edward Olmos like near the beginning, and I was like, is he supposed to be Asian? What's happening here? Like, I'm so confused about this whole character and what he looks like and who he's supposed to be. And right away they have a voiceover talking about like language and how there's like English and Japanese and Spanish, and like to like very quickly gloss over the fact that like despite that it's all just set dressing, right? But they like try to write it off with this text. And then as a part of the like, othering and who's worthy, there is another voiceover where he talks about, if I remember, I know he says the N-word and it's disturbing. Harrison Ford's character Deckard says it. And I think it's in relation to like how the replicants are treated. And so like, that's all shoved into these voiceovers to be like, no, we understand what we're doing. And the rest of us are like, oh, this is not good at all. Like, no.
Yeah. Okay.
I didn't know about the N-word use in the voiceover.
Like the full word, it's very jarring. And you're like, oh, okay, buddy.
Do you think that was just an improv? That was part of him trying to get them not to use it? I did read that Deckard was supposed to wear a hat as an homage to like the 1940s noir aesthetic, but he had just made Indiana Jones. So Harrison Ford was like, I'm not wearing a hat in this movie. I have to admit that I missed, probably in my like interrupted watching, I missed the big theme, maybe the big question of the movie, which is like, is Deckard a replicant himself? Completely passed me by until looking it up afterwards. So like that maybe would have given me a little bit more depth of like what this story is instead. Like, I think this is just a little bit different audience expectation today versus 40 years ago. But the notion of like, just because this guy is the central character, you still have to convince me that he's the protagonist. Like, I don't think he's the driver of this story. I just think he's like a bad guy doing bad things. And call me when Rutger Hauer's back on screen. So I don't know. Like, I wonder if that was just my reading or if it was.
That part of it is very minor, to be honest. So like there is a line when Rachel, who is the replicant he assaults, except it's supposed to be sexy for some reason, because they put that like jazz music over it when he's like literally pushing her and forcing her to like say that she wants him. It's highly disturbing. Yeah. But she says, have you ever done the test on yourself? To be like, and so that's insinuated there. And then in the director's cut, like, I believe if I remember correctly, it ends with them just kind of like in the elevator, sort of like Graduate style, where it's just like, it like cuts off there. And so I think there's a supposed to be some kind of subtle like hint towards maybe he's also a replicant. In the theatrical release, they like shoved in a happy ending, and they are literally like driving along the coast somewhere together in a car, just like sailing off into the sunset to be lovers together. And it's so weird. Like, it doesn't feel cohesive at all to the like tone of this movie.
Yeah.
I think the arc that Deckard has is actually very familiar to a kind of noir genre pattern, and that basically you start with this detective, and this detective is essentially self-interested, right? But he sort of like has these maybe like minor feelings toward wanting to do something good. He comes across a case, he does a case, and then by the end of the case, he realizes that he was actually just a pawn for evil, and that whatever mission he thought he was going to accomplish or redemptive arc he thought he was going to have, it turned out like actually it was the opposite. And all of it was for nothing. And it was like so easy to dupe because these like larger institutions are so much bigger and so much more powerful and so much more opaque than he had ever imagined. Like, I think that whole arc for me, it tracks in so far as like it's an established pattern. I think what didn't really work for me as this whole thing was unfurling is that you're at least like until the end-ish supposed to be on board as Deckard goes and sort of basically like kills these like very innocent robots who aren't really like doing anything. Like, okay, they killed like the people that they like, who's like spaceship they took hostage or whatever.
Right.
But, you know, like their desire, their primary motivation, which is to continue living, is a very sympathetic motivation. And so for me, the movie does not seem to really understand how sympathetic the replicants are vis-a-vis Deckard. And so even though, for example, after he kills the like showgirl sex bot or whatever.
Yeah.
Like even after he kills her and then he like is shaking and needs a drink, I'm kind of like, oh, all cops are bastards. Like, I don't know, like what I like the idea that like the movie wants me to sympathize with him because he feels bad about having killed someone. Like, I'm not with you. Even just on like an emotional investment level, I'm not really able to like get onto the movie's wavelength that it's supposed to get for me.
He saves Decker from falling. Like, he hunts him down in the house in the Bradbury building, which you cannot go into anymore in LA, which is a huge bummer. It's owned by Neue House. And so now I'm trying to get into a Neue House event just so I can see that fucking building because it's incredible. But yeah, he ends up saving Deckard, and then there's a really bad voiceover that's like, I don't know why he saved me, but he did. And then he just like turns off. Like,
yes, and then like the dove flies into the air, and then you're like, oh, maybe like the replicant did have a soul.
Yeah.
No, you're right.
Sorry, I'm not to dispute any of what you're saying. I just wanted to clarify if that was also a difference.
No, I think that's important. I think my larger point still stands in that, like, you know, Roy keeps saying things like, I've seen things that like you can never imagine. And I'm just like, what are they, Roy? I would really like to know, because you obviously are so much more interesting than like the character we've been saddled as the protagonist. And yeah, again, I just don't think that like B movie truly has like I just don't think that like Deckard is like interesting enough as like a vehicle for us to get so much more time with him versus the other characters.
I don't really think Harrison Ford is ever interesting enough ever. So, you know,
just, you know, get off my plane very well.
Yeah. But, you know, like that, this is an interesting point of like, I hear you. And, you know, I think I'm like caught up in the race and gender of who the replicants are and who gets time and who doesn't and what that looks like. But, you know, there's a little bit of we as the audience are being asked to understand the sort of plight of these replicants through, you know, narrative, whatever. And I think there's a question of like, is it enough? And what I'm hearing from you is that like, we're not getting enough from the perspective of the replicants and understanding like who they are and their struggles. And I think for me, there's a question of like, but then what turns into too much exposition, or should the movie just be from their perspective?
Well,
right?
that's the main, like, I've never read Philip K. Dick, so I could be completely talking out of my ass, but I'm way more interested in the question, do androids dream of electric sheep, than I am in watching the movie Blade Runner about the Blade Runner. Like that, I think, is where that's like the major flaw of the movie. And not to say that like it's all in the title, but, you know, I actually was thinking of again, I haven't read the original book, but the movie Never Let Me Go, or Never Let You Go, with Andrew Garfield and and there's a lot of stories. Keira Knightley, Carey Mulligan. There's a lot of stories that do this, like the question of, you know, the whole cyberpunk season are androids human? Can they have sentience? Can they have souls, etc.? But also like the way that in this movie, they're painted as children in a way. Like there is something about the fact that they only get to live for a few years. And so how exploited they are is being held at the same time as like how inexperienced they are and how little they maybe know of the world. Daryl Hannah is probably the best example of any of the characters who is just trying to get by, I guess. And like, yeah, that was just way more compelling.
Yeah, she's really coded as like a teenage runaway.
Yeah. I mean, maybe because that's the kind of eyeliner I wore when I was a teenager.
But also she has this like, you know, it 100% the teenager runaway and like very childish, like very not like emotionally developed. And when she meets the genetic designer, you know, there's this, like I quickly was like, oh, did she know that was his house and she's manipulating him so they can take over the house and get support from him? Like, so it felt like before it was like teenage runaway. And then I was like, oh, this is a part of their plan to live, right? Mm-hmm. Like to find all of the people that can help them actually like stay alive.
Yeah,
but they don't explain that. Like you're just like, oh, was this a happy coincidence or did they actually like was this intentional?
Right, because he definitely knew what he was doing.
Yeah.
I think the other reason why plot wise I really just started checking out mentally towards the end is that both like Tyrell and the genetic maker, the toy master, whatever, they're both these like scientists who know exactly what they have made, and yet they are killed by them and are just so like fucking dumb. I don't know if you can say fucking.
Yeah.
And so like I just like sat there being like, why are these like uber villains so stupid? And for me, like the much more interesting concept here is about sort of like this like idea that all of these like almost like ungovernable products that are out there that pose a threat to human life supposedly are corporate made. And it reminded me of that story that came out of Google like a month ago about like the whistleblower who was like, Google has made an AI and like now it's getting way too smart and like everyone needs to know about this. And I think like so much of like the really like beautiful frisson in that is that like there's no real government outside of like a police state anymore. And so it's really the corporations who are running this world and why this world is so terrible. And yet if these like really powerful, really smart puppet masters, if all they're doing is like getting killed in like the dumbest ways by their own creations, it's just not satisfying.
Oh no, my robot can choke me with her thighs. I mean, certainly the world building is undeniable. Like, I'm not going to pretend that I didn't find it like rich and interesting, even if I took offense to a lot of the way the world was built. But what is interesting there is like, I think a lot of the movies in this ilk go into like, there is the very high level story that's happening or something that's happening, you know, at within the corporations, the government. And then there's like, how does it affect the actual individual? We looked at Tron, which came out later the same year. And this was like developers at the company, but there's maybe what is the connection to the average video game player, right? So in this world, there is something that I wanted to see more of. And I do think I watched a little bit of the sequel and I could tell I was going to actually enjoy it. So I'm going to.
Oh, it's so bad. Oh, it's awful.
I really loved Dune. So I was like, I think I'm going to dig this, but I stopped watching.
You know what I'll say about I have no doubt that we did a podcast episode on it, so y'all can reference that. But I will say that it like aesthetically was stripped of everything that made Blade Runner like actually visually stimulating in the production design. It's very like Dune, like it's sleek, it's slick, it feels like an Apple fucking keynote. It's just, it's not gritty and like it's I think that was a really disappointing component of an otherwise fucking terrible movie in so many ways. And rewatching the original Blade Runner, I was like, so many of us love this movie because of the production design and the lighting, you know?
You don't like a movie that's like 3 hours of orange and yellow light?
But maybe I'm wrong then in hoping that the sequel would bring forth more of the like, how do replicants or like replicant technology find their way into the average person's life? So we see a little bit of that when we go to like the market, or he's looking for the synthetic snake skin, like that piece of it where I was like, oh, I'm curious about this. Like, is this more than just potentially for escaped replicants, or is this something that is like really integrated into the fabric of life in this 2019, which again, I just didn't, the story, just the central story wasn't interesting enough to me. And so I was like, oh, there's so much in this world that I could be intrigued by. But yeah, whether or not this guy feels bad for taking orders and then takes it out on a clearly traumatized Rachel, then who cares? Like, I don't want to see it. I don't want to see that.
I mean, who likes watching cops ever? You know, you're just like, I don't need to watch cops. I know. One thing that I noticed in this viewing that I never noticed before, which is related to the sort of like the cultural like picking. I can't think of the right word right now, but like they're like
picking?
we go to the Japanese noodle bar, and then there's like the Japanese guy who makes the eyeballs, which I gotta say that scene was fucking hilarious, where the other replicant just like was placing eyeballs on him randomly. I was like, that is such a weird power flex. But what I never noticed before was that there is an Egyptian man. So they go to see Hassan, and they're playing Arabic music for the only time in the whole fucking movie. The music is Arabic, and you know you're going to go to see the Arabic guy. And that area of town looks like a Medina that you would see in Arab, like Morocco's for example, is the only place I've seen a Medina, but like they're in a lot of Arab towns. They have these like really intricate shopping areas, and then that's like gone. Right? Like, it's just like, cool. We have that, like, look at how multicultural Los Angeles of 2019 is in all of these different areas. And it just felt very like shoved in, right? Like with the music and the name and all of it. And like, it's such a passing, fleeting moment that barely has any dialogue, right? It's like, do you know who Snakeskin this is? Is this yours? You know, whatever.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, if you want to dive into that further, he is sort of supposed to be, I think, like a modern day snake charmer. He's like an Egyptian guy. He has like a artificial snake. But then it even turns out that like he's a peddler of like really cheap fake snakes. And like the guy who makes a really artisan fake snakes is like a white guy who's like much richer, because white people are smarter than people of color. I could truly like rant about all of the little microaggressions in this film for an hour, but I will spare you guys.
No, I mean, I think that's a huge part of like, you know, like you said at the beginning, like people are so caught up in the the aesthetic and the history and the lore and the fandom, and just like, God, how can you not love Blade Runner if you like are actually a nerd? Like, what's wrong with you? Or if you're like films. And I think that it's really important to be pointing out all of these like very large problems with the movie.
I mean, I think the thing that makes it sort of like hard with this movie is that the same thing that I think like it's almost sort of like the racism makes it exciting, right? Mm-hmm. Like it gives you, it's not just that like all of these different multicultural details are grotesque. It's that they're sort of like exciting in the same way that like the naked girl who has like all of the dots on her, like the sparkle dots or whatever,
right,
all over her body is like exciting. This is like
and you know, I was like, who the fuck puts on a like see-through raincoat to escape? And I was like, this is just some sexist bullshit so that we could watch the blood and watch her die grotesquely as she's like, you know, in her body as she's like running through the streets and being murdered.
Yeah, but it just like felt very much a kind of post-white flight vision of a quote unquote inner city, where like the city is like the place that you go for like excitement with this like layer of seediness to it, and it's sort of like where you go to experience different cultures, but that place is distinctly not quote unquote America and distinctly not like quote unquote home. And so it really continually reinforces like who the movie is supposed to be for, because you're supposed to like identify a very specific way with like the white characters versus who is the white characters, but specifically Deckard, who is either always like grossed out or sort of like minorly inconvenienced at like the most benign level.
Yeah, because you know his noodle dealer doesn't know the difference between 2 and 4.
His noodle dealer, who is like even kind of a slime ball because he speaks perfectly good English and yet pretends not to because he doesn't want to take Deckard's order correctly. Like it's just like a very like, here is this like trickster Asian figure, which is just like, I think kind of like an older stereotype of like Asians in this country. Yeah. But again, just like really dealing with like a lot of these like really explosive, really hostile tropes in like a way that like I think like the movie just like either doesn't fundamentally understand or just like doesn't have full control over, or if we want to be sort of like more quote unquote sympathetic, it's just like what appealed to white people in the early 1980s.
And I think that one of the images that is really lasting for me, like that if you asked me to describe a scene from Blade Runner before I'd ever seen it, like over the years, I'm picturing this sort of gritty cityscape with that holographic geisha advertisement. Like that, I think, is always what I've remembered about, like, this is Los Angeles in like a dystopian future. So watching it again, I was kind of like, there's not even like a through line of what they're saying about what the culture is in this place. It's a little bit of this and it's a little bit of that. So there's just like, I think a lot of sci-fi does or like dystopian futuristic media will do the haves and the have-nots, and we're going to see it be very gritty and hard scrabble for the majority of people, and then we're going to see that clean, futuristic, sleek, white, silver for the like people at the top. Here, it's interesting that everyone is to some extent like in the muck with everyone else, but it just didn't feel like a very purposefully designed muck. Like it was just like, well, this stereotype works for this scene, and this graphic or this image works for what we think is going to look cool. That said, yeah, looks cool. It's just fucked up.
I think that chaos is sort of like there for a reason. Mm-hmm. It's just sort of like the city that everyone who could get away has already gotten away from. because they go live like high above the earth, or they go live in like a space colony or whatever.
Elysium.
I did have to laugh at the idea of a housing shortage in Los Angeles in 2019.
Totally not interesting, but Coca-Cola is the official futuristic soda of Blade Runner, while Pepsi is the official futuristic soda of Total Recall, which is another episode we watch. It's just interesting to just watch all of these back to back and see what product placement and like rivalries and like what they have to mask in some way to be like, this has lasted for centuries or whatever as the thing. I would be remiss before we wrap up if we didn't at least point out some of the tech stuff that's in this. So one is the speed hair dryer, which I feel like is literally just like a salon hair dryer that makes your hair look perfect, not just dries it. But the real one here is the photo scan and enhance, right?
Yeah.
Like they spend so much time on that. And I would love to call out my friend, Nicole He, who made a video game making fun of this, where you literally yell enhance at the game to enhance things on the screen to see if it works or not. And it's fucking hilarious. And I will link it in the show notes. But like, this is such an epic example of like, just zoom in the little tiny thing in the background and you'll be able to figure it out. And they do it for I don't know if I was just high, but I'm like, this lasted a really long time.
Yeah, because he's like calling pixel coordinates out to the machine, and it really does go on for a long time. Although,
yeah, and I was like, you could have got to the mirror a lot faster than that. Like, I don't really know what your deal was, but okay.
I feel like the only other scene that goes on for that long a period is the scene where Roy kills Tyrell, and like he just like pushes his thumbs into Tyrell's eyes. And I was just like, this is like minute 4 of the scene. What are we doing here? But then I was really shocked that like so much of this eye violence, I guess, like has like precedent, because I feel like so many contemporary movies, especially horror movies now, just like continuously like things into the eye socket. And I'm so sick of seeing it. And then it was kind of startling to see it like in this 40-year-old movie.
Yeah, I'm very fascinated by like the beginnings of tropes, right? Like we go back and watch things and you're like, oh man, that's so exhausting. And you're like, but this was the first time it was ever done. I'm not saying that's the case for this, but like, it can be a little bit hard to, as like contemporary viewers, to go back and be like, wow, that was like a first time or a big deal or whatever it might've been, when it's just been used over and over and over again. But yes, eyeball gouging is, something I could do without.
Well, and just on that same scene, like the kiss that he gives him right before gouging his eyes to death, like, do you think that was supposed to just be shocking? Like that was just supposed to be like, look at this replicant. He's taking all sorts of extreme pleasure in killing his maker, like, or I don't know. I just didn't know how I was supposed to interpret that.
I think it's I feel like it's a part of the weird, sinister, evil trope thing. Like, yeah. I don't know if I don't read it as anything more than like, this guy is like wild and a little bit queer coded and like, zany, and therefore he's evil. Right. Is kind of how I saw it. But
yeah, I don't know how to interpret it either. There is definitely this like sort of hypersexualization of the replicants, but you never get the sense that hypersexualization is coming from themselves, because obviously what they're meant to do is sort of like be at the service of humans. So I don't know. I guess my final question to you guys is, if we have all of these like female sex spots, would you be into Roy as a male sex spot for straight women?
Representationally, or just like, are we horny enough for Roy?
Horny. Are you horny for Roy? Is my question.
That's a cat question.
I know. I'm always horny for everyone. It's a problem. Yeah, sure.
Okay.
He's not my type, but he's not like broken nosed enough for Kat. God, I know. I like I like a very broad spectrum of movie star, but I felt like he was an interesting character. So I was like, okay, I'll spend more time with Roy.
All right, y'all. We will be right back with some freakouts.
The Games and Online Harassment Hotline is a text message-based, anonymous, and confidential emotional support hotline. And it's created specifically for the gaming community. Because we're gamers and creators, and we want to help each other. So, how does it work? Well, you text us and we listen. Our hotline is 100% anonymous. We can talk about anything you need to, and only what you want to. The Games and Online Harassment Hotline is an inclusive resource for anyone, no matter how you identify. If you feel that you need emotional support, you can start right now by texting support to 23368, and our qualified responders will be there to listen to you, free of charge. Reach out, get help, and let's make this community a better place to work and play.
What's your freak out? Now it's time to talk about what's been thrilling us, moving us, upsetting us, or infuriating us this past week. Inkoo, what are you watching? What's making you feel all the freakouts?
I have two suggestions. One will be very LA specific, and then one will be like the opposite. But since we're already in LA in the past, I'm going to shout out a show called Angelyne, which is sort of about like this very famous blonde woman in my childhood who would have billboards of herself, like usually with like very big blonde hair, big boobs. Sometimes she has like her pink car with her, usually sunglasses so you can't really see her eyes. Her name on the billboards, Angelyne. And then basically no other information. You had no idea what she was selling. It's a little bit like this geisha in Blade Runner.
Yeah.
You're just like, what is this for? And nobody ever really knew. I think a lot of like the way people sort of talk about her now is sort of like Kim Kardashian before Kim Kardashian, and that she's like famous for being famous. Anyway, on Peacock, yes, that's a real thing. There is a 5-part drama series sort of like reimagining what and who Angelyne is. And it's actually a really good show. And so that would be one show I am recommending. The other one is called P-Valley, which is on a network called Starz, which is also a real network. And basically it is about a strip club that is Black owned, like Black dominated in Mississippi. And season 2 is happening right now. It's just like an unbelievably good show, like amazing spectacle, which you probably love because you love Blade Runner. And yet at the same time, really great characters. And basically, with regard to all of these social issues, the exact opposite of what we got from Blade Runner. And so I really love this show. And I think it really should find an audience, a larger audience.
The Starz conundrum. Vita also was a show that didn't get nearly enough attention. And yeah, I have to keep watching Angelyne. Definitely. I mean, I grew up with Angelyne, she was always there. And then every once in a while you'd get a real sighting of her in the car. Amazing.
I've never had an Angelyne sighting, so I feel really sad.
Oh no.
And now I don't live in LA anymore.
Anita, what are you reading, watching, etc.?
I want to shout out a novella, which is great for our listeners who don't like to read a lot because it's short. It's called The Empress of Salt and Fortune by Nghi. And I don't even know how to describe it, so I'm just going to read the blurb. With the heart of an Atwood tale and the visuals of a classic Asian period drama, The Empress of Salt and Fortune is a tightly and lushly written narrative about empire, storytelling, and the anger of women. A young royal from the far north is sent south for a political marriage, alone and sometimes reviled. She has only her servants on her side. This evocative debut chronicles her rise to power through the eyes of her handmaiden, at once feminist high fantasy and a thrilling indictment of monarchy. I like, yes, but also like it's different than this. Like this, I don't like, someone was like, what are you reading? I was like, I have no idea how to explain it. The story is told through the lens of the handmaiden as like, they're much older and living alone and solitary. And like, there are these people who come and like stay with her, and she's recounting the story to these people. And like, that creates a different lens and framing on the way the story is told. Right. Cause it's not just like in real time, it's like through the lens of a lens. There's also like all this beautiful little whimsical stuff in this that is just super my jam, where the person that comes to stay with the handmaiden is, with not the clergy, but something that feels related to clergy. And they travel with a bird, and the bird remembers everything. The bird has like, so while the clergy member might not remember the whole story, the bird will. And it was a big deal that this handmaiden shares this story, right? Because then it becomes part of the official canon, the official like knowledge base, right? And then the bird's babies then take, like, they pass the memory down, and it's such, that piece of it is such a little part of the story, but I love that kind of whimsical fantasy, interesting component of it. So yeah, it was like, I don't know, maybe an hour read. I'm kind of a slow reader, but it was really lovely. And I think there might be more, because it's, unlike the Goodreads profile, it says the Singing Hills cycle #1, but I haven't read any more, and I don't know if there are more. But anyways, that's my freak out.
Cool.
Kat, what are you freaking out about?
Well, it felt only appropriate during this Blade Runner episode to shout out the video essay, Los Angeles Plays Itself. I guess that's probably, a video essay is how it's described. It's from 2003 by Thom Andersen. I watched it on Mubi when I had a free month of Mubi, but you can also rent it or get it from your local library. It's a beautiful collage of scenery from films paired with narration. And as a native Angelino, watching it and seeing the places that I know, but also the places that I know even better because I've seen them on screen, is a really satisfying experience. I would not imagine, I mean, it would be impossible for it to be very comprehensive, but even at 3 hours, I feel like I could have watched 3 days worth of it, because there are so many communities that it could go into, so many cultures that, exist or have existed in Los Angeles, but maybe have never been shown on screen. So it's kind of it's a great blend of everything from Boys in the Hood to LA Story to early days when Los Angeles was filling in for other cities. And it was less likely for film productions to actually go to those places. And it's also a really great sort of history. What's the word I'm looking for? A time capsule. Yeah, film history and a time capsule of Los Angeles. Like, you get to see Bunker Hill before it is the Bunker Hill that it is today. And obviously, Blade Runner features in this essay because you see the Bradbury Building and other like architectural icons of the city that are used in scenes in this movie. Yeah, and I recommend it. And I would love to watch one about New York, and I'd love to watch one about, like, you name it.
Yeah,
two cities in America.
What's that?
There are 2 cities in America.
That's it.
Fine.
This has been on my watch list forever. Carolyn told me to watch it, and I am like so thankful for this reminder, because I have such an affinity for LA and like recognizing LA in movies. And I know that's kind of stupid, but it, it's whatever. Okay, can I just add something really stupid to this that only people from LA will appreciate? So the Block is this like shopping complex downtown. It's where the LA Alamo Draft House is. It has the fucking worst parking lot.
It's terrible.
And not only is the parking lot itself terrible, to get into it, you have to drive around in this like spiral circle. And no matter how many times I do that drive, it never feels like it's going to end. Like, it goes on at least like 30 seconds longer than you think it should every time, even when you know it's coming. Okay. So like, and like, I've been like, sometimes it's full and you like, there's nowhere to go. And there's like, it's a nightmare. This parking lot sucks. Okay, whatever. Parking in LA. Wow. Boo-hoo us, right? The reason I bring this up is because I've been watching The Old Man, which is the spy show with Jeff Bridges. And there's literally a shot of this fucking parking lot, and I nearly fell off my couch because it's also beautiful. Like that show has beautiful cinematography. And so like there's this round part that says like Flower and 8th Street really big. Like it's very obvious that it's this parking lot, and it's just like perfectly framed, and they like drive around it and then they pull up. And I just like couldn't remove the fact that I knew exactly this location and had such strong feelings about this location from the fact that it was just like a cool shot that somebody scouted, and like, you know, it was to like do a thing and then leave. It had nothing to do with this shopping complex, but it's these weird moments, right? Like, even like in Blade Runner and every fucking car commercial that takes place in a city, the LA tunnels, right? Like if you've never seen them, the first time you see them, you'll recognize them because they've been in so many movies. Like there's just so many iconic pieces around in the city that because LA is where Hollywood is. I think what would be interesting, you're talking about like a New York version, but like Toronto and Vancouver, right?
Yeah.
Like so much of the industry has been moved to Canada, and like they try to hide that it's Canada, and like how does that peek through? So yeah. All right. Thank you for indulging my block parking lot hatred.
Well, that is our show for today. Inkoo, thank you so much for joining us. Where can people find you on the internet?
I am on Twitter at Inkoo Kang, INKOOKANG, and my work is at The Washington Post.
You can find me at Anita Sarkeesian on Twitter, Instagram, and all the things.
I'm Kat Spada. You can find me at cat_EX_machina on Twitter. And you can find Feminist Frequency at FemFreak on all the things.
If you are a Patreon subscriber, be sure to stick around for the bonus episode with our special guest, Inkoo Kang.
If you like our show, please help other people find it by subscribing, rating, and commenting on your favorite podcatcher.
Thanks so much for listening.